Shabbat Shalom. Hope
Shabbat
everybody's
shalom.
doing well.
Shalom.
So I'm going to ask you to mute yourselves because we're going to recite the blessing for studying Torah, which I have forgotten over the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to share my screen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Sandy Nelson is coming. So we are in the middle of the book of Deuteronomy, and we're almost at the end of the entire Torah, believe it or not. So we're on chapter 30, verse 11, and I am going to share with you my screen with, okay. Hi, Sandy. All righty. So I found a way to trick the website. It had all these ads in it, but when I narrowed the frame, they disappeared or they went to the bottom or something. So would somebody like to read? We're in the middle of, this is the Torah portion of Nitzavim, part of which we read at the high holidays. So we're actually going to read right now something that we read on Yom Kippur. Doug, would you like to read?
Sure. So up at 11.
11, yeah.
There we go. Now what I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It is not up in heaven so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so you may obey it. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you're entering to possess.
Okay, so this is what we read at the high holidays about the teaching not being too far from us. So what are they saying? You know, what's the Torah saying here?
You should obey the word of God.
Well, you certainly have to obey the word of God, but what is God saying about?
That is not too difficult.
It's not too difficult. You know, it's okay. It's coming from heaven. It's coming from God. It's beyond our understanding in certain ways, but the teachings are not all that difficult to actually obey. So I'm going to share something else with you, which is the handout that I sent. And here we are. So you see it says choose life. Yeah. Okay. So this is Rabbi Jonathan Klieger. Moses himself makes clear that he's speaking across the generations, addressing every single individual, from the leaders to the woodchoppers, men, women, and children, and even those who are not yet present to hear him speak. So remember, that was what we read last time, is, you know, that range of people that are included at this point, which was not so clear when we were at Mount Sinai. And remember, we talked about who the woodchoppers were and what that represented in society. And then remember that this is also what we read at the high holidays. We are bound by a covenant, whether we like it or not, as Jews. That's just the reality, the fundamental reality of who we are. We can choose to reject it, but it is something that we, God made this thing. It's done, right? He calls us to do teshuvah, to return to God, to our people, to our land. He calls us to open our hearts, to love the source of life with all your heart and your soul. He insists that this change of heart is possible. and that we do not need intermediaries to accomplish it. So what's interesting here is you have direct access to this teaching, and you can open your heart to it, and your heart. Remember that we saw a metaphor at one point about circumcising your heart. And so the idea is that it's creating an opening to receive the word of God, to be conscious of God. So this is what we just read. It's very close to you, so close that it's repeated twice here. Okay. So Moses says, so when he's saying the mitzvot are not so far away. So on the one hand, what he's saying is, and this is Moses speaking for God, it's not so complicated and difficult, okay? But what it really means on a sort of, metaphorical level is that it's a change of your whole sort of being. It's not just I'm doing the mitzvot. I mean, doing the mitzvot changes who you are, okay? That's the idea anyway. And how does it do that? Because when you do a mitzvah, let's say you say a blessing before you eat a piece of bread or before you drink wine. That blessing is reminding you that this is, an honor, something we should be grateful for, that we have bread and wine or a roof over our heads or whatever it is. And the blessing gives us a moment to stop and be more conscious and more intentional about what we're doing. So it changes who you are in that sense, because you're a more conscious person. And then as you do the blessing, you might think, gee, I have a piece of bread. Well, where did it come from? There was a farmer and there was a this and that, and you hopefully are more grateful for everybody involved in making this possible for you. So Moses says that we're capable of change. So before we follow the Torah, maybe we're not, the best people, but then we follow the Torah, we follow the mitzvot. As I said, it's not just the moral and ethical mitzvot that say to you, don't steal or, love your neighbor as yourself. It's also the ritual ones that are giving you more intentionality, more consciousness, more sensitivity to the world. Moses insists that we're capable of opening our hearts, of choosing life and goodness, no matter how far we have strayed from our goal. Even if you are scattered at the ends of the world, from there, Yod He Vav He, God's name, will gather you and bring you back. So the idea of choosing life is, first of all, doesn't mean I get to choose life and so I'm not going to die. It means I'm going to choose a worthy life, an ethical life. Mm-hmm. And you're also making a choice to follow the path of goodness rather than the path of evil, because we always are faced with those two options. So Judaism doesn't believe that we're born into sin, there's original sin. We believe that we're always capable of choosing the right way or choosing the wrong way. And the word for Jewish law is halacha, which is from the word halach, to walk. So it's the path. And we can always take it if we want, and if we stray and we get off of it, we can always come back. So Moses is being the ultimate spiritual teacher here at the end of his teaching. He's telling us that our self-limiting beliefs are keeping us from fully participating in the unfolding of creation. It is not in heaven or across the sea. It is close to you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can feel Moses's sense of urgency as he exhorts us, his people, to enter the promised land, the land of human fulfillment. We have a noble task to perform, to expand our sense of the possible. We are to do teshuvah and align our beliefs about ourselves with our true and magnificent potential. We are to choose life and aliveness so that, as Moses says, we and our descendants may live long upon the good earth that the Creator has granted to us. And of course, this is also the message of the high holidays, right? Because the rabbis weren't dumb. They picked things that had something to do with the high holidays. The Baal Shem Tov taught that divine sparks are hidden and trapped throughout creation. waiting to be liberated, and that every single person has their own unique set of divine sparks waiting for them to reveal and uplift. No one else can fulfill the noble task of being you. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel taught, the challenge I face is how to actualize the quiet eminence of my being. So let's take a minute and just talk about the interpretation of here of choosing life. What does that really mean? What does it mean to follow the mitzvot? How can it make a difference in your life? How can it transform you? Yeah, Ellie, please.
I was just thinking like how we were talking about how it's, following the Torah, it's not that hard, right? I mean, it's like within our reach and within our capabilities. But then I think like when we were talking about saying a blessing over bread and wine, how it just brings like that sense of awareness. And I think of it like as gratitude too, right? But once you get that awareness or that consciousness, like I feel like you can't be aware of it or be unconscious of it again after, right? But I think a lot of people may be like afraid because in a way it is kind of harder, like because like once you have that knowledge or that awareness, you can't just do it, you know what I'm saying? Like it's
Absolutely.
One. Yeah.
Once you're aware, you can't not be aware. I mean, you could try. So that's why I've said before that the rabbis say that we should give to beggars. And the idea is if you don't, the first time you don't do it, you feel guilty. Then you start kind of just like not wanting to deal with it. And eventually you don't even notice. So you don't want to have a hardened heart. And so, it goes back to the heart. Here, again, we talk about opening the heart, circumcising the heart. So we're taking away something that is blocking. So what is it blocking? What is it that we're blocking if we're not following the mitzvot? Again, morally, ethically, as well as ritually. The rituals always have some ethical dimension because if you're more aware, that's already an ethical, beginning. Doug.
Brings us to a place where we're able to find our own potential and what our own value is within greater society. I mean, I think before our tradition, and if you look at a lot of ancient traditions, it was more external in some ways. And this was, I think, in one of the great gifts, we talked about the gifts that that Jews bring to the world. I think this is one of the great gifts because it is an opportunity for all of us to do something, not just for the community and for the greater world, but at the same time finding those sparks in us. And I think we do that through mitzvot.
Yeah, the concept that we all have a divine spark. I mean, not that was, completely introduced by the Kabbalists, because certainly, we're all in the divine image and everything, but they really articulated in a way that I think is really beautiful that, we have this spark. And the idea in Kabbalistic theology is that the way the world was created was that God was everything and everywhere. And in order to create the world, had to retreat, what's called tzimtzum, and let out this little tiny, ray of light. And it was supposed to be captured in these vessels. And this is all metaphor, right? But the light was supposed to be captured in the vessels, but the light was so powerful that that the vessel shattered. And that's what created the material world, including us. So everything has that spark of God in it. And the idea of the mitzvot is to do, when you do a mitzvah, it supposedly releases a spark. So of course, it's not like, okay, I'm lighting a candle, now a spark for my book has been released. Obviously, again, it's all metaphor, it's all stuff that's very hard to articulate. So, they made it as concrete as possible while not getting you too crazy trying to match it. But I will say that I have a friend who's a rabbi whose son is an astrophysicist.
Yeah.
And he said that this, Kabbalistic idea about how it's a Lurianic idea of how the world was created is very close to astrophysics.
Right.
There's a big bang, of course, first of all, but there's also the idea that if you start with gas, which light is sort of like gas, right? I've been both and whatever. But anyway, as it goes out, further and further away, it cools off. And the more it cools off, it eventually becomes hard matter, right? So the idea of the vessels shattering and forming the material world after this ray came out is so close. I mean, and even the idea of that little ray going out and the Big Bang and all of that, I mean, somehow they seem to have plugged in to realities of the universe without science. It's really amazing. The other day I was also studying something else. This is from a 1920s Kabbalist or Hasidic rabbi, and he was talking about time, and that time really doesn't exist. There's really no past. There's really no future, right? It's just this moment, and the way he was talking about time was very close to quantum physics, mechanics. I don't know. I asked someone yesterday to please explain relativity to me again, because the idea that time is, that it's not fixed. Can't get it through my brain, but I now have an algebraic formula that makes it a little more acceptable. But anyway, so these guys somehow opening your heart, I mean, it can mean a lot of things, but I think it also means connecting on a really deep spiritual level to God, to the source. And when you do that, when you're completely connected, I think you feel the vibes of what's really going on Earth. I mean, they really plugged into these theories that were not, physically provable or mathematically provable. So I think there are a lot of levels of opening your heart, of choosing life. I mean, one is to be a decent person in the world. But eventually it's also, if you want to have some sort of mystical connection with God, you have to open your heart. You have to be intentional. The whole spirituality movement in Judaism is about being intentional. And you do that in a lot of ways, meditating. But again, every mitzvah that you do, if you're really conscious of it, makes you more intentional about everything in your life. So the commentary that I read is clearly a modern one, retrojecting this kind of spiritual approach. But the guys who wrote the Torah were probably pretty connected to God. I don't think they had as many, barriers that we now have. And I think the idea of circumcising the heart is really a beautiful metaphor too, for, peeling away all the layers of, some of it is important, right? If you didn't have certain restrictions, to how you behaved or did, you wouldn't, last very long. But we also have to sometimes be able to let go. There was a book by a woman who had a stroke, and it affected the left part of her brain to the extent that, a lot of the defenses that she had weren't there. So on the one hand, she really had like a mystical experience because it was right brain, but she also could walk into walls. So and we really need the balance. Right? Okay, any other comments? And so, somebody put, what is eminence? Did I use the word eminence? Teresa? Where is she? Oh, there she is.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's at the end of the Bel Shem Tov paragraph.
Oh, okay. I
It's
thought
how
I had
we
used it.
like-
I thought, ooh, all right, let me just take a look. I think it means, how you manifest in the world. Yes, that's the name of the book. Suzanne is like a little encyclopedia. Every time I mention something, she's got the source. My Stroke of Insight, yes, by Jill Bolt Taylor. It's a very interesting book, actually. For those of us who are very, very left brain, it's very hard for me.
Question.
Yes, please.
I have a problem with those people at the stoplights and stuff begging, because so many of them are not who they say they are. So I feel guilty when I don't give them anything, but I feel guilty when I do, because I feel like I'm encouraging.
Well, okay, so I think you could probably take the rabbi's admonition in a less literal way. So if you don't feel comfortable giving to people on the street, you can give
I
to a
give to
food bank.
Salvation Army and stuff like that.
Okay, and you prepare all the meals for our, quarterly feeding. So that does, kind of make up for not giving people on the street.
You know what I do, Rabbi? I
What?
tend to have like fast food coupons
Yeah,
or a
that's a good thing.
baggie with a toothbrush and some wipes and
Right.
toothpaste, because it's not our position to determine how they use the money.
Exactly.
But if you're worried about perpetuating a problem, if they do have a problem, if they're hungry, they're delighted to have a McDonald's $5 coupon.
Right. Yeah, so there are different ways of doing it. And I think the main idea is not to just close your eyes to what's going on.
Right.
You know, like, living, a lot of people live in gated communities and never go anywhere that's different. Or like West LA, to never go past the 405, because like that's the nice, beautiful area. So, people are insulated and they don't know. And then, sometimes you might, consider yourself to be a liberal, but then try to have somebody, that you don't like living next door. I'm not talking about people who are, going to like be dangerous, but just, so sometimes, or, a lot of the rabbis in the South, really put their, jobs on the line to fight against slavery. And a lot of Northern people came down to, protest, but they weren't putting their lives on the line, or their jobs. And they were perfectly happy to say, liberate them, but then don't come north and live in my neighborhood and make my kids go to school with you, right? Okay, I'm not saying everybody's guilty of that. I'm just saying, that does happen. Yeah.
It reminds me of a story, Rabbi. My cousin is very socially active, and one year for Seder at her house, she actually invited some gang members who actually came. And if you think that this group of socially liberal Jews was totally comfortable with the gang members at the table, you would be wrong. There were a lot of people who were like, okay, yeah, we're okay to a degree. But people were definitely not comfortable. But you have to force people out of their comfort zones. And my cousin did it in the most dramatic way she could. And, we had conversation, and it wasn't natural or easy, but, I'll still remember that Seder forever.
Oh yeah, that's great. Well, Brian Stevenson, who's Harvard educated lawyer, wrote Just Mercy, and they made a movie out of it, etc. He says you have to be proximate. In other words, if it's something you're imagining on the other side of the 405 or whatever, right? I mean, that's not really getting to know people and really understanding, So, okay, let's go on to the next commentary. All right, do you see the commentary?
Part of it.
Okay, no, I just want to make sure it wasn't the Bible.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm gonna move it up this way. Okay, Dr. Arnold Eisen, who was chancellor at JTS for many years. I'm not sure if he's leaving or not, but anyhow. Okay, does somebody want to read this?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Moses tests the credibility of his audience here, insisting that although God's demands are difficult to fulfill, they are by no means out of reach. We are commanded to infuse God's word into daily life, bring them down from the mountain, practice justice, act with compassion, and do this not just in our private lives, but in the streets, politics and society, foreign policy and business. We should think of that in Washington.
Exactly.
Must be in accordance with God's instructions as interpreted by the prophet and sages. The law must be equal in complexity to the situations it orders. The task is difficult, very difficult, and rarely mastered. And yet Moses insists that there is an alignment between the regiment of mitzvah and our natures. What God demands and promises is not beyond the realm of possibility. Far from it. The davar, the thing, the word is very close to you. Otherwise, he seems to say, there would be no chance that we would heed it. Maimonides, in his laws of teshuvah, repentance, urges us not to doubt that we human beings have the capacity to choose good over evil. He cites as his proof text the final passage from Parashat Mitzvah,
That's what we're reading right now.
which I greatly treasure. The essence of the teaching Moses wants all of Israel to hear and act on in every generation. See, I set before you this day life and good, death and evil. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life so that you and your children after you will live. Moses is aware that much remains beyond our control of individuals. We have to play the cards we are dealt, as they say. We cannot change the past, but there is so much we can change, so much we do control. And in that imminent space of possibility, like a land beyond a narrow river, lies the chance for a life well lived, a person who receives and bestows blessing, a community that practices goodness and mitigates suffering.
Thank you. Oh. So it's interesting. He starts off by basically saying, Moses is saying, you know, this teaching is not so difficult, but hey, if you really think about it, why is it so difficult? Why would such a teaching be so difficult to follow the mitzvot? I mean, in the end, he says, yeah, we have a certain amount of control, but why is it so difficult to follow the mitzvot, do you think? Why doesn't Washington follow them?
Yeah, that's what I say.
I have a comment regarding
please.
that. That ties in with what Sandy brought up. If you have your set of principles.
Libby, I'm in Torah class. I'll call you back.
Susie, you're not muted.
I muted her.
Okay. If you have your set of principles, those can dictate your being, quote unquote, too honest, and interfere with others' interpretation of what you, and I hate the word should, because of the principle of should-itis in counseling. Rabbi, you know what I mean.
Yeah, but we're talking about religion, so it's okay.
Yeah, but nonetheless, it applies. Anyway, my point is, if your principles are your own and not accepted by others, you come in conflict with what mitzvot to give and what not to give, much like what Sandy Nelson has projected or discussed.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely, that's definitely one of the big obstacles is that, you know, if you're principled and the other person isn't, how do you handle it? I mean, you could maybe even talk about political parties where one party does dirty tricks and the other one says we're going to be so pure that, you know, anybody who transgresses a tiny bit is going to get kicked out. So, you know, who's going to win in the end? And actually, that was another interesting thing that Dr. Andrew Rayfeld, who's the president of Hebrew Union College, I told you I put up on our YouTube channel his analysis of the election, if you're interested. So, and there's a shorter TBE version without all the stuff at the beginning. That's really mostly for the PAR members that it was for. Anyway, he talked about the difference between prophetic Judaism and practical Judaism. So he said that he thought one of the reasons that the Democrats did not do as well as they had expected was because of during the summer, all the protests that were going on and the sense of, you know, needing law and order, and that, you know, they really got worried, and that probably that added to votes for the, you know, Republicans. It's his theory. I don't know if he's correct, but again, it's like, okay, do you go out in the streets and protest because prophetically that is what you feel called to do? Or do you say, you know what, practically this is going to have a counter effect on the election, which is more important? I don't know. I mean, yeah, as you said, Felice, how do you choose? You know, if you want to be practical, prophetic, pure, impure. What are
Exactly.
some of the other obstacles to, you know, be able to fulfill the mitzvot? Why is it so difficult?
I
guess
think, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's just like you said, Rabbi, that sometimes it's difficult to know what the mitzvah means. You can look at it
Okay,
one
so
way.
it's sometimes hard to know what it means. But
Yeah.
let's say you know what it means. Let's say you know that you're supposed to give a certain percentage of your income to charity. Okay, and you say, why would it be hard to do that? Oh, Ellie, go ahead.
Well, even before your example, which is perfect for what I was going to say, it's because it requires you to make a sacrifice.
I think so. Not only a sacrifice, but hey, you know, we have the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Hatov, the tendency for good and the tendency for, you know, bad. That's why God says, I put before you evil and good, you know, choose. And we're always able to choose. But hey, that other part of us, let's say you want to lose a few pounds, but there's a beautiful chocolate cake sitting there. So with all the good intentions in the world, what are you going to do? Maybe have a slice or two of the cake. So, you know, that's something that's not as harmful as some other things, but, you know, you're running a business, okay? And all these environmentalists want you to do one study after the other about, you know, what the impact of your, whatever your building is, you know, that's going to cost extra money, which, you know, maybe you're going to have to pass on to the consumer, or maybe you're going to have to take a loss, or, you know, how do you choose? You know, I did my rabbinic thesis on employer-employee relations in medieval codes. Okay, anyway, it sounds fascinating. But I came across a modern story, which was an Orthodox Jew from New Hampshire. This was, you know, like the, you know, cloth business, what's it called? You know, where you're making, mills, you know, it was a mill. Sounds like, so it was one of the recessions that we've had, and he chose to keep paying his employees, you know, until they could get back on their feet, which, you know, not everybody can afford that, but wow, you know, that's somebody who's taking, you know, the mitzvot seriously, as opposed to, yes, I, you know, said the right blessing before I did something, but then I went out and screwed my employees, right? So yeah, go ahead, Sandy.
Well, one thing that I realize is that sometimes your ability to do good is just related to how much money you have or how many resources you have. And then I look at people like Warren Buffett and what's it from Microsoft, and they set up that charity, right? And they make things right with the world. At least they do their best. Whereas on the other hand, the Koch brothers,
They support the ballet and the museum.
you know, they actually they've also done they support some things with public television too.
Oh, yeah.
But on the other hand, they went around and went to all the different legislatures and set up these codes how to screw the Democrats, basically, you know.
Oh, and also how to put more people in jail.
And how to do new laws. They wrote
the laws, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just saying that some people take advantage of the money they have to do good, and some people take advantage of the money they have. Even what's Sheldon Elders, what's his name?
Adelson.
To do bad, to do evil, to do what I consider to be. He doesn't consider it evil.
So let me just challenge you for a second about this, because yes, on the other end, they're giving money to good causes, but how do they make the money in the first place? I'm not necessarily casting aspersions on any of the people you mentioned, but I'm just saying, you know, what if you pay your employees, like Amazon? I will mention Amazon because I try not to use it as much as possible. They pay their employees teensy amounts of money, and the conditions aren't always so great. I won't go into all the details. Anyway, Jeff Bezos is one of the richest men in the world. So okay, now he's got all this extra money. He bought the Washington Post. Glad he saved it. But, you know, is it justifiable to make your money by any means and then to be generous later? I don't know. I'm not ruling on it. Hi, Stacy. I'm not ruling on it. I'm just saying, we're talking about why it's so difficult to follow the mitzvot. And, because on the one hand, Moses says it's easy, but how easy really is it? Go ahead, Jason.
Well, I mean, maybe it's too simplistic a point, but we all have the capability of all the good and good traits and negative traits in us. And we have to work hard sometimes at repressing the ones that want to rise up. And, the Torah gives us very clear examples early on. I mean, Abraham has so much zeal, he, is ready to sacrifice his son. And Moses even, gets angry enough to strike the rock. I mean, we don't have to look far to find that they are giving us examples very clearly of that people can go too far with things. And we're all totally capable of it at any moment of falling prey to the worst instincts because they're in us. And we're not made any different from anyone else. We all have that ability. And so, of course, it's hard work. You are always going to have the pull because it's in you.
Yeah. Not only is it in us so that the pull is there to, eat the piece of chocolate cake or whatever it is, but we're, often faced with moral dilemmas where what is the answer? It's not easy. Sometimes you have to do something that isn't so great, because you have to do, something else that's more important or significant or whatever. It's very hard to know. It's not even like you can, I'm going to follow the Torah and so I'll never do anything wrong. I mean, there are too many circumstances that are ambivalent, right? And then in retrospect, you can say, well, I should have done this, but hindsight, right?
Sometimes it's not even making choices between good and bad. It's getting caught up in the busyness of every day, like getting so caught up in everything that you have to do that you just don't make time to do the right things. There are so many things that can distract you from what you want to do that eventually you get to the end of the year and you realize I didn't do this, this, and this.
Absolutely. And I think that's the idea behind the mitzvot, is to be more intentional. So you don't just kind of live your life almost on autopilot. I'm sure we've all had the experience of driving somewhere and all of a sudden you realize you've driven to the office or something. It's just like, and that's the whole thing about, when Moses notices that the burning bush is not being consumed, that is not a coincidence, because he's walking along his path, right? Halacha is path. Okay, anyway, but no, he's just walking along the path. He's a shepherd. And he says, let me turn aside. This bush is burning, but it's not being consumed. So first of all, he has to get off the path, right? He has to get off that, like, okay, all year long doing whatever. And then you go, wait a minute, I never, tutored that kid I was going to tutor, or whatever it was that I was going to do, right? So he gets off the path. And I'm sure there were lots of other people walking past that burning bush and didn't notice, because to notice, you have to spend some time, right? To look and go, huh. And it's only when he turns aside after noticing it that God actually speaks to him. So God doesn't leap out at him. God only meets him halfway, basically, because we have to take a step too. We have to take the time to take that step, which is what Shabbat is about, right? I'm not saying I practice what I preach, okay? I'm just saying the idea of Shabbat is to take that moment and say, actually, it was interesting. Sophia Loren, is an actress who is now 86, if you can believe it, still looks pretty good.
Wow.
Yeah, so she's got a new movie that's going to be, I think, on Netflix. And she hasn't done a movie in 10 years. And before that, she had stopped doing movies at a certain point. And I'm not saying everybody has the luxury of doing this, but she said in an interview that, I realized I was always in the studio, I was always away, and I had 2 children and I wanted to, have time with my children. So she stopped making movies. Now you could say, well, she's the kind of person who's wealthy enough that she could afford to do that. On the other hand, the draw of fame, and I mean, she was a very, very popular actress, very admired, and she was gorgeous and all that. that's something to sacrifice, to give up, that attention, right? That some people seem to need very, very badly. She made that sacrifice in favor of a value that she believed in, and so she wanted to act on it. But so there's a draw there. The draw is, power, fame. And that's the sacrifice of Abraham, as far as, I can tell in terms of modern life, is people who are too busy to bother with their kids.
One of the reasons, though, that she made this movie is because it is about social justice. And it talks about a woman who was a pretty bad woman, although she was a survivor.
Yeah.
But then she takes in this child, and I'm anxious to see it. I don't even get Netflix, but I think I'll have to change, at least somehow get it. Has it? But
I think it's just this weekend is being released. I think yesterday, maybe even. I'm not sure.
Well, but she went back not just to get, well, her son directed it,
Yes.
but mainly because it made a statement.
Absolutely.
The woman is 86 years old and incredible.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, because she said the reason that she had not been doing a movie in 10 years, which has nothing to do with being with her kids, who are now probably grandparents themselves, but was because she was looking for the right script, and this one really spoke to her. And thanks for pointing that out, Ruth. Looking forward to seeing it. So, it's sort of ironic, this teaching is not too far from you. Yeah, we all are capable of doing a certain amount, but it's not so easy. But I guess what this particular commentator that I showed you, I guess concludes is that we can do something. It doesn't have to be everything. Any last comments before we go on? I think we're going to read.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
as an educator, and others have brought up timing, as an educator, the phrase, the teachable moment.
Mm-hmm.
And this relates to what we're talking about, that it has to be at the appropriate time in life, at the age stage that you are, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Timing of the mitzvah, or the lack of of your ability at that time to do
Right.
them.
Right. And Rosenzweig, who's a Jewish philosopher, he actually was about to convert to Christianity. And he attended a service on Yom Kippur and decided not to. And he got more and more involved in Jewish stuff. But, when someone said, are you going to be laying tefillin, those little leather boxes, he said, not yet. So in other words, it's right now, it doesn't speak to me, but maybe next year I'll feel differently. So we have to be open, because it is a path that doesn't ever end. As we know, we'll see if we get to that today, the end of the Torah portion is about Moses' death. He doesn't make it to the promised land. It's always a journey. We never get there. That's what the Torah is telling us by cutting it off there. Because you know what? And the Israelites don't make it into the promised land either, right? Joshua is when they do, which is the next book. And there's some scholarly thinking that once they were sick, the Torah was 6 books, but they lopped off Joshua. So I think they're telling us, don't expect to ever get there. Because as soon as you get there, it's not enough, right? I mean, I don't know if you've had this experience, but like when I was at PBS, if only I could have this title, if only I could have that title. Then I had it and it was like, who cares? I mean, the title doesn't mean anything, like what's the next thing I need to accomplish? So I think, we're, even when we get there, we don't, you're a billionaire, never enough, right? Got to make more billions. So I think it's okay not to be there yet, as long as we do a little bit, every time we, can.
That generalization is too broad for me. I understand your premise. Just personalizing, my husband was a cowboy at one time.
Yeah.
And he was very proud of becoming a college professor.
Well, that's a journey.
Yeah.
No, I'm not saying, look, I was ordained, right? so I could use the title rabbi. I mean, that is accomplishing something, a lot of years of study. No, yeah, there's an accomplishment, absolutely. And I don't mean to diminish the accomplishment. But then it's like, okay, I'm a rabbi, now what? I mean, it's not like now I'm here and I can just sit around and not do anything for the rest of my life. That's what I mean by,
Right.
yeah, the title, there are different examples. Yes, you're right about that. I mean, the title
And-
didn't mean that much until rabbi meant more. Being
Right,
assistant
right.
director of a
And
department. What?
it also brings up the ideal and your real self.
True.
Your self-image and self-concept
True.
and
True.
self-confidence and so on.
Right. Because what's important is what you achieve internally, not the, the title or whatever, but it's hard not to, care about that. But it's just that anytime you achieve what you want, sometimes you feel really good about it, but sometimes it doesn't feel as, you think when I get there, here's how I'm going to feel. And that's not how you usually feel. You may be proud. Okay, now I did this, but it's sort of like you had a goal and that gave you motivation. And when the goal is reached, you need another one. Because that's how we are, I think.
But I do think your statement, Rabbi, is so true. Life is a journey. And even when you get somewhere, there's always somewhere else to go.
Absolutely.
You may not get there, as we said with Moses, of course, and the Israelites who were in the desert. It took another generation, but at least, you do the best you can and don't give up.
Thank you. Spoken from a woman who has been amazingly courageous and strong. Who's been
No,
through...
not necessarily. Let's not go into
yes,
that.
you have.
Please.
Yes, you have. It's true. I mean, because even, I'm sorry.
Beautifully stated, Ruth.
Yes, beautifully stated. Because even, let's say, you achieve something you've been always wanting to have, whatever it is. But then, you're knocked over by something that happens in life, which is unfortunately how life goes, right? You lose somebody important to you. Then it's like, how do I cope with this next? There's always something else to cope with, right? And it's how you cope with it that's important, whether you give up. And unfortunately, a lot of people do give up. And then those are the people you see sitting, staring, and, it's sad. But, finding motivation is not always so easy. Okay, we're going to go on a little bit with the Bible. Okay. So we got to 17, I think. We actually should have gone a little bit further, but that's okay. All right. Doug, you want to continue reading?
Yes. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, and that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. But the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
So here, God keeps using this language of choice, choose life, choose this. But hey, if you don't choose it, guess what's going to happen to you? I'm going to punish you. And I've already given you a whole list of all the awful things that are going to happen. And I'm going to give you more just in case that you forgot. So, it's one of these kind of oxymoronic choices, right? Choose life, do the mitzvot, do what you're supposed to do. And by the way, I'm calling heaven and earth, which is pretty much everything, as witnesses against you. So that doesn't sound so like such a pleasant laying out of choices. But anyway, we're gonna, how do I get to the, see, these are where all the ads went. Okay, so if I want to go to the next one, I think, do I just hit this? Yeah, okay. All right, so now, no, I don't want a free prayer guide. Thank you very much. Joshua is going to be installed as the leader. So let's read about this.
After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give them to the Israelites. I'll
Okay,
give
can I
you
ask you a question before you go on?
y'all.
Is there anything weird about this? Anybody? No? Okay, I have to see something here. Wait a minute. Is this the right chapter? No.
No,
I'm thinking.
we
after
should
the
be
death
in
of-
Parsha Vayelech.
No, I know. I don't know what happened. I don't know what
Oh.
happened. Because he's reading after the death of Moses. And I'm like, wait a minute. I didn't notice that Moses had died. Okay, I'm trying to type Deuteronomy in here. Why is it not?
Yeah, we skipped to the next book.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I didn't know how to use that website properly. So
I think
now I need to go back.
I saw links that showed like Deuteronomy 28 this way, 30 this way. They were on the bottom.
Oh, did I go the wrong direction? Oh, did I go in the wrong
But I
direction?
think
Okay.
somehow it jumped you to another book.
Oh, I see what happened. Okay. What happened? I see what the, oh, okay. I see the double arrow I thought was the one that would go all the way to the end, and the little arrow would go to one chapter, but it's the other way around. All right, so this is really so annoying. What chapter are we in? Deuteronomy
31,
31.
chapter 31, verse 1.
That's what I was trying to get to. Okay.
Yeah.
It is about Joshua succeeding Moses, and that's why I was all like, because it is about Joshua being installed. And so, but I thought after the death of Moses, wait, okay. So 31, okay, so we finished 30, right?
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to, okay, yeah, I'm all turned around because now we're in a different Torah portion. Okay, so I'm going to share this now that I know what's going on.
What happened to Suzanne Pollock?
We're going to read her. We're going to read her, but after we read Deuteronomy, okay? Because it is about I'm about to die and I'm going to install you. So when you were reading Joshua's installation, I thought, yeah, that's where we are. And then like after Moses died. Okay. I know there's no before or after in the Torah, but that was a bit much. Okay, go ahead.
All right. Then Moses went out and spoke these words to all Israel. I am now 120 years old, and I am no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. The Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you and will take possession of their land. Joshua also will cross over ahead of you, as the Lord said. And the Lord will do to them what he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, whom he destroyed along their land. The Lord will deliver you to them, and you must do to them all that I've commanded you. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the presence of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors to give them, and you must divide among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged.
Thank you. So this be strong and courageous, chazak v'ametz, is an expression that is, kind of well known from the Bible. So that's what we're going to read about now. New share. Here's my handout, and there we are. Okay, we're going to get to Suzanne Pollock. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. This was one more commentary on what we read before. I apologize. We'll read it anyway. Okay, Suzanne, you want to read Suzanne?
Behold, I give before you this day the life and the good, the death and the evil, blessing and curse, and you shall choose life so that you will live, you and your seed. What does it mean to choose life? The Hebrew word for life, chaim, is a plural noun. The Hasidim have a play on words which provides an interesting insight explaining the composition of chaim. On an occasion of joy, engagement, marriage, birth, It is only when drinking wine or liquor that we cry out l'chaim, meaning to life. Why not also say l'chaim when drinking water, which is so basic to the formation of life? They answer that the Hebrew word for wine, yayin, has 2 yuds, as does the Hebrew word for liquor, yash, literally yayin saraf, fiery wine. The Hebrew letter yud is tied to yid, Yehudi or Jew, a toast usually being invoked to celebrate 2 Jews coming together in marriage or joining for a birth celebration, or generally within the familial context of Kiddush on Friday evening. The Hebrew word for water, mayim, has only 1 yud. God has declared that it is not good for the human being to be alone. Genesis 2:18. Hence, say the Hasidim, the Hebrew word for life consists of 4 letters, the exterior letters being het and mim, spelling home, warmth, love, surrounding 2 yods, which are not separated by any other letter. And the beverages which go along with the toast also require 2 yods, Jews, together as in the Hebrew words yayin and yash.
I know Doug is smiling because this is his area, languages. We're not going to spend too much time on it. You know, if you don't know Hebrew, it's probably a little confusing to read this, but the point is that, you know, why do we say l'chaim only over wine and not over water? Because l'chaim is a toast to 2 people coming together. So it's got 2 yuds in it, which is 2 Hebrew letters. Anyway, it's kind of a little fun thing, but not all that profound. Okay, now we're going to talk about chazak ve'ematz, which is that term that I mentioned before. So you want to read that, Carol?
As soon as I unmute, yes. One phrase is repeated 3 times over the course of our parsha. The first time it is mentioned to the entire Israelite nation, the second and third to Joshua. The phrase is
chazak ve'ematz.
Chazak ve'emetz, be strong and emboldened. The first time it is mentioned, our ancestors are told not to fear the other nations because God marches alongside them. They are never alone. God is always by their side to help in all their endeavors. After the Israelites' fears are assuaged, Moses tells Joshua the same words, Chazak ve'ematz, to not fear, that he'll be able to do his job as the leader of the people. He tells it to him twice in verses 7 and 23. However, the context is completely different. In verse 7, Joshua is told that the land of Israel was sworn by God to their ancestors and that he will be the one to lead them into it. In verse 23, Joshua is told, in addition to this, God will be with him. Why did God need to repeat that? Isn't it obvious that God will be there? Sometimes hearing by itself is not enough. We need to be reassured that what we heard is correct. After all, our greatest leader, Moses, needed to be reassured once, not twice, not even 3, but 4 times that he was meant to lead our ancestors out of Egypt. How much more so does Joshua require reassurance that he will be successful as the next leader after our greatest prophet ever. Furthermore, in verse 7, Moses called to Joshua, telling him to be strong and emboldened. In verse 23, he commanded him to do so. He wants it solidified in Joshua's head to have faith in his abilities to lead the Israelite people to the promised land and to conquer it from their enemies.
Thank you. So I think this is very apropos, just that, you know, people aren't so sure about being a leader. It's not easy, you know, to lead, especially the Israelites, you know, remember they leave Egypt, they start complaining right away about how good the food was when they were slaves. So it's not easy, you know, and you have to make decisions and take responsibility for them. And, you know, unless you're a certain kind of narcissistic person, you think that you're completely capable of it without any experience whatsoever. Chazak ve'ematz is an expression that, like, if, you know, if somebody that you know needs some courage or whatever, you would say that to them. So yeah, Moses had to be reassured. Remember, he didn't want it. When he saw God in the burning bush, he said, take someone else. And Jeremiah, the prophet, did the same thing. no thanks. I'm not worthy. I'm not capable. Interesting, Moses, we're not sure what his speech defect was, but one of the theories is that he had a stutter. It's just really interesting that he couldn't speak in the beginning, right? He had to bring Aaron with him. Deuteronomy is entirely his speech. So by the time, he gets to this point in his life, he's a great orator. And interesting that Joe Biden is also a stutterer. And amazingly, he just you never, ever, ever hear him stutter. Richard Levy, who was the head of the rabbinic program when I was at Hebrew Union College, also had a stutter, except he did occasionally actually stutter. But Joe Biden, and whoa, I don't know what kind of speech therapist he had, but really, that takes intention and determination, right? So any comments before we do the very end of this? Well, it's worried at the end of that Torah portion, but now after this, see, Moses is going to have to step down as the leader. So here's the question. Is that unfair? He's being punished supposedly for having hit the rock instead of speaking to it. But what is going on here? Why, after everything he did, he took everybody out of Egypt, he put up with them for 40 years of complaining. Why is he not able to lead them into the promised land, aside from, the punishment story? But what is it also trying to tell us, maybe?
I think it's trying to tell us that you need young leadership in this time. And I think we all felt it through this last election. What are these two old white men doing running for president when there's that second and third tier, such as Pete Buttigieg or Amy Klobuchar, who are ready to, step up to the plate and have very different ideas. And now everything is going to have to be postponed. And
no, I agree with you.
On their level, everything is now, it's going to be pushed back 4 to 8 years.
Well, there's also the issue of what's going to happen within the party itself, because they're the young, more sort of left leaning, and then there's the old guard, and how they're going to resolve all that. So yes, I do think that there's a time when you have to say, I have to cede to the next generation.
And I think it's a parallel to what happened during the Exodus, which is that the first generation, which came out of slavery, that generation died off. It's the second generation raised in the desert without this experience of slavery and what life had been in Egypt. They're the ones that are going to cross the Jordan. So it's really a message affirming the strength of younger people and that we should have confidence in them.
Yes, I agree.
Because they're younger doesn't mean there's more, that they're stupid, because they're not.
Who? The older people?
Well, older people tend to look upon the younger generation as going to hell in a handbasket,
Yeah. Well, I think that's really what it's telling us on some level, that, there's a point at which it's time to move on. And not only that, the skills that Moses had to take people out of Egypt are not necessarily the same skills for conquering the land and running it, or setting it up for future, administrations. So, there's a point at which you just have to say, that's it, I got to go. Actually, my friend Jane Quant, who was at the First Congregational Church, I am sure they would have kept her for years, but, she said, I've been here long enough, it's time for someone else to take over. So
I think that's a good lesson also for tenured professors, because you could literally be teaching till the day you die in the classroom. And there is a time to step aside. When you're in your 70s, I think you have a moral responsibility to step aside so someone else can take your place, someone younger.
And I would say the same thing about the Supreme Court.
Oh, yeah.
At some point, it's time for another generation.
You know, when you only live to be 65, 69 years old, it wasn't an issue, but people are living into their hundreds. I think it actually is an ethical question of our time.
Yes. What do people think?
I think that's a really important point. I think that's a super important point because, you know, if we look at it from the modern perspective as well, you know, I was just telling my son who's been visiting or up here for the past week, you know, that it's, you know, for the next election cycle, hopefully there'll be more people in his generation because my generation, Gen X, didn't really have a whole lot of oomph for politics and wasn't overly interested. So we, you know, we're the little tiny generation. And I've always said that we were kind of the generation to finally go, somebody else has to go ahead and do something. And there are so many in the younger generation who have such amazing ideas and having taught them for years, these are some incredible kids who are now incredible adults, and they're going to have incredible ideas to bring our country to someplace new and different. And I think that's really what we're saying in this section of the Torah as well, is that, you know, all these ideas that we had from the baby boomers and the generation before, and what that has ultimately meant for the country and why that was important at that point in time for the country, you know, and then what's going to happen next. And that's really what we see here in the Torah portion. What was before isn't really what's needed now. And I think we sense that in our country as well.
Yes. Well said. Well said. Anybody else? Oh, okay. Suzanne in the chat says, but we need to provide sufficient support as society for the older generation to make a graceful exit without needing to continue to work to survive. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, some people keep working because they need the money. And yeah, we don't take care of them. I mean, we're not saying the older generation should just be tossed out and forgotten. It's just that maybe there's another place that would be a better place for us to serve. Yes, Jason.
An interesting area to look at, actually. I've been studying quite a lot about Native American and tribal governments, and quite a lot of them are led by people in their 20s and 30s right now. And even though there's more respect in those cultures generally for the wisdom of the elders than we have as a society at large, they have very dramatically in many tribes put a lot of very young people in charge, and they are, you know, they're thriving in part because of the youth, and they are able to see, you know, they were not the ones who were brought up in the poverty of the reservation. Some of them have been brought up as these tribes have started to gain, you know, more self-sustaining abilities and such. So in some ways it is a parallel, right? They, you know, like in the tribe that I work for, the older generation, they grew up before the tribe had any money, and they lived in shacks with no electricity as children and no running water. And, you know, they realize in some ways that they're not the ones to lead the next stage of growth. It's the ones who have new ideas for how to, you know, take where they are now and go forward, because the other generation already took them on one journey out of poverty, right? Into some kind of ability of self-sustaining life. And now it's the next generation to lead them in where they're going to go from here. And it's quite interesting. It's a parallel.
Definitely.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Felicia, I think we need to be careful of ageism, like racism, and generalize too much. Like a three-legged stool, if you put success, sustained motivation, you talked about skills and abilities for success, but also success meaning in this context leadership, also the attitude and sustained motivation of the individual who is the leader that we need to consider and not to generalize.
Yes, thank you for that admonition. It is true, you know, you could have somebody who's older who is more than willing to be innovative and creative and all of that, as opposed to let's do things the way we've always done them. And so, yes, we're not saying that older people can't contribute. No, but the point is, I think what Jane was saying is there's also stepping aside to give somebody younger an opportunity that otherwise they wouldn't be able to get if you just, hung on. And, obviously everything is complicated and complex and there's no one answer. And you're right to point out, and I don't believe in ageism either, being an older person, but
maybe a combination of young and old. Due respect to pushing aside senility.
of course.
That's an extreme when you're old, or seemingly when you're old. Not to be political, but to bring the young and old together and come up with compromises.
Yeah, I mean, look, Bernie Sanders is not exactly a young man, and he galvanized young people like crazy, right? And he definitely has more innovative ideas than the typical Democrat. But so yeah, it's certainly possible, and it's not always, appropriate to say, okay, you're this. I mean, there are places that when you're 65, you're forced to retire, and so I don't think that's.
Something that Jason had said that I think is also that's important. When I was in New Mexico, a lot of the tribes in New Mexico who do have a lot of young tribal leaders are very much the ones who pushed to get people registered to vote for this election. That included the elders who previously may have felt either one, that they didn't want to vote, or two, disenfranchised by the entire system. And it was the younger groups that did this. Often in New Mexico and Arizona was because they didn't have an address. And in those states, a formal address. And in those states, they said, if you don't have a formal address, then you don't get to vote, sorry. So the older generation was like, yeah, I guess we don't get to vote. It was the younger leaders who came forward and said, okay, guess what? We will create street addresses necessary to go ahead and match with the Arizona and New Mexico voter registration system. And then I just this past week was listening to an interview of some of the tribal elders who weren't necessarily in leadership positions any longer, but said, had it not been for the younger push to do this one man said, I don't know if I ever would have voted. But he voted for the first time in his life in New Mexico in this election. And that was because of some of the vision of some of the younger leaders. So again, that brings that concept together of both the younger and the older working together for the betterment of society, and how it's sometimes the actions of some of the younger and the wisdom of some, and how that can kind of come together versus pushing somebody aside. I thought that was such a great example in both New Mexico and Arizona that wound up having very significant results even for this election.
That's fabulous. That's a great story. Thank you for telling us about that. That's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
Any other, I mean, look, it's all complicated. That's why following the mitzvot is not easy, because, where's the better part of wisdom here? Felice? Okay. All right. So we're going to read about Moses. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Doug, for bringing that to my attention as well as everyone else's. I hadn't heard that, but thank you.
It was a very uplifting story for me. I mean, just listening to, especially having just been out in New Mexico and seeing when you see a cross-generational action for the betterment of society, it's something that's very powerful. And as Rabbi was saying, as I was looking at Bernie Sanders, being an older gentleman with so many of the younger followers, and I thought that's fascinating to me. That is that's interesting how that socio-dynamic occurred. But then to be able to see this from a real sense in smaller communities of government like tribal, I just thought it was a very appropriate story for this.
It is absolutely.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, we're just going to read a little bit more. We're not going to get to Moses's death this week because I've got a lot of stuff that I found midrash, and that's going to be something we want to linger on a little bit. But let's look at where we are here. So now we just have Joshua is going to succeed Moses. And before we get to Moses' death, we have a little bit of material to read through. So who would like to read this?
Are we on 9?
Yeah.
Oh, I'll read it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll read it. So Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the Levitical priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord and to all the elders of Israel. Then Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, in the year for canceling debts, during the festival of tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you will read this law before them in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and children, and the foreigners residing in your towns, so that they can listen and learn to fear the Lord your God and follow carefully all the words of this law. Their children who do not know this law must hear it and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess.
Thank you. So every 7 years, the Torah is going to be read to the assembled people so that they, because they didn't each have a copy of the Torah at home or a little pocket Torah to carry around. So they would know what, they were supposed to do. So just to remind them, every 7 years, the Torah would be read out publicly during the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, which is a happy holiday, and the year of canceling the debts. So,
Rabbi Singer?
Yes, please.
I thought the Torah was basically not written down in those days. Oh, that's the no, now and then in the Torah.
Well, I think the Talmud was not written down. It was an oral transmission, but the Torah, there were some Torah scrolls, so that's why it was read to people, because everyone couldn't get their own copy. So the priest or whoever, was supposed to, unfurl the Torah and read it to people every 7 years. And that's how they took care of making sure everybody was aware of what the rules were.
Okay.
Yeah. But the Talmud, yeah. I was just going to say the Talmud was not written down. So the Talmud, was an orally transmitted, well, it was first the Mishnah. And then in the year 200 CE, Judah the Prince, who was the head of the community, decided he better write it down because they had just lost the war against the Romans, and things could be destroyed. But then the commentary on that was also oral until a few hundred years later. Mishnah means repeating. That's why it's called the Mishnah, because it was repeated from person to person. Yes, Jane.
I have a question because on the foreigners who are living with you, are they following Jewish law or are they under their own law?
No, they're supposed to follow the law of the citizens. Yeah.
That's the usual standard operating procedure, but I wondered about it.
Yeah. We read about the Ger Toshav. Is that what you're thinking about? Oh,
does that make them Jewish?
No.
Following the law?
No, they're called a Ger Toshav, which is actually what we were just reading about. It's this week's Torah portion, that Abraham is the Ger Toshav, the resident alien.
Yeah.
A sort of oxymoron, but it's somebody who's living with you who's not an Israelite, or because there really wasn't conversion in those days.
Right.
You just joined, and I guess you decided your God is my God, but it's somebody who had to follow the law and who was taken care of, but he was not actually an Israelite. And a Ger was a stranger.
Right.
It became the word became in the Talmud the word for convert. But Ger Toshav does not mean convert. And even though Ruth is considered the first convert, she didn't really go through a conversion. She just said, I'm going to follow you.
Right.
Right. And your God will be my God. And that's all she actually did.
I think it's also great PR from a modern point of view to read the Torah out every 7 years, and the foreigners have to listen to it. There you are living in the society. You see how this life is modeled. Then you get, the official version. Terrific PR.
That's funny. I'm just looking to see if there's any interesting note about this. Okay, this is interesting. This is after, so it's interesting because first, Moses basically says, I'm not going to make it. Says to, Joshua, be strong and courageous. And then all of a sudden he's talking about the festival of booths and reading the Torah. And it says here, after Moses mentions his own inability to cross the Jordan, he might have been expected to continue immediately with the statement that Joshua will lead Israel across, right? He's told him to be strong and of, good courage, but it's not like he turned around and said to everybody, here's your new leader. He starts talking about something completely different. Instead, he first mentions that God will lead Israel across and defeat the enemy. By saying this first, he makes clear that God's role, not Joshua's, is decisive. For this theological concept, okay, that's a whole other thing. Okay, and then now that Moses finished expounding the teaching, which he has imparted orally until now, he writes it down. So here's Moses quickly writing down everything he heard on Mount Sinai that apparently he didn't write on Mount Sinai. He's writing it now, which is only 40 years later. You can imagine what his memory might have been like 40 years later. He writes it down and arranges for its regular reading, public reading, so that the people may be reminded regularly of its contents and future generations may learn it. The writing of the teaching was part of the process that eventually led to the creation of sacred scripture. Thank you. The public reading of the teaching is part of the democratic character of biblical religion. So it's read to everybody. Everybody has access to it, which is how the Israelite religion got democratized, because before that it was orally transmitted from priest to priest. So you can imagine how many ordinary people had any clue what was going on. So it'd be like if, the government had laws that you didn't know about, you couldn't check, and they just say, here's the law and this is what we're going to do to you. So that's how it was before. The white kitty, very cute. Yeah,
He's our new kitty.
Oh. Can we see?
He sits with me when I do my Hebrew, and it's funny that he's with me with Torah study. I think that he's Jewish.
Yeah, my cat walked across the Torah, so during a service.
Now he's lying on it.
Can we see his little face?
Yeah, here, Joey. Say hi. There he is.
Oh, hello, kitty. What's
His
the name?
is Joey.
Joey?
We just adopted him from the pound.
Oh.
And he's named after Joe Biden.
Oh, how sweet. Very, very sweet.
We'll never forget the day he was adopted.
Really? That's great. Anyway, so just to conclude, so when it was an oral transmission, only the priests had the information, and so they would just say, do this or do that, and you wouldn't know whether what they were saying was accurate or whatever. But now that if the Torah is read out loud to everybody, so every 7 years, then you had access to it as well. And of course, once it was written down, it was always the same forever. It reinterpreted, but there it was written down for all to see and know. And so once, yeah.
I was going to say, I have a question on what was written down by Moses, because here in the comments it indicates that the laws and other parts of Deuteronomy are what Moses wrote down. Were the other parts already in scrolls?
It depends on if you're asking a scholar, if you're asking a religious person. I mean, the way we think the Torah was put together was that there were several, schools of priests with their own stories, and eventually it was all merged together. So it came from a lot of different sources from different periods of time too, Deuteronomy being, the later book. But Moses, according to the tradition, Moses is now going to write down the entire Torah, including the story about his death and what happens after he dies, which is what led, I think I'm trying to remember I can't remember which rabbi. It might have even been Ibn Ezra who started to wonder about this. Anyway, the rabbis were starting to wonder about, wait a minute, how could Moses have written about his death? And, and of course there are ways of explaining it, like God dictated to him how it was all going to happen. So he wrote it down, but obviously that's not what happened. I don't think Moses wrote any of this in terms of a scholarly approach to this. We don't even know if Moses actually existed. We don't know if the Exodus existed. So it's all sort of mythical storytelling, you know. Some of it's probably true and some of it is probably not. And if it was orally transmitted, you can imagine how the story gets changed from person to person, from generation to generation. Okay, so we're
Rabbi,
meeting again. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, just clarify. This is the letter E, J, P, H, and D that you're talking about? The writer?
Oh, you're talking about the
Different
documentary. The
Dick
documentary.
knows what I'm getting at. We're in a class that Aaron Visban teaches, and
Yes.
you know, I've heard this before.
Right.
So is that what you're referring to?
Yes. Well, the documentary hypothesis posits four main sources for the Torah. Subsequent research has said there's, you know, probably many more sources, but, you know, roughly you could say there are these four sources. They were identified by, you know, grammar and things like that, and how God is referred to, and that's how they identified, you know, this strain is from this particular source because this is how they refer to God, and this strain uses this language and whatever. Richard Elliott Friedman wrote a book called Who Wrote the Bible, which is really about this theory for the Torah itself, not for the entire Bible. And he also published a version of the Torah with different colors and different, you know, italics and bold and whatever to distinguish the different sources. So next time we're actually in person, I could show that to you. I've brought it to Torah study a few times.
Oh, that's fabulous. Ooh, I'd love to see that.
Yeah, well,
yeah. I would too. Yeah.
So occasionally I refer to it, but the book of Deuteronomy is considered a separate source in and of itself. It's the D source. So the book wouldn't be so interesting for Deuteronomy. By the way, you know, it keeps saying over and over again, you shall do this in the place which I will show you, which is never identified, even though it's said over and over and over again. And it's through the book of Deuteronomy that the cult was centered in Jerusalem, right? It had been sort of scattered around, and supposedly, okay, thank you, Suzanne. There's a brief review of the documentary hypothesis in the introduction to the Jewish Study Bible. Is that pink book, or the Jewish Study Bible? Well, mine has a pink cover. Felice, do you have that Jewish Study
Yes,
Bible?
I do. I'm sure I've read it before, and
okay, so
I'll review it again. Thank you.
So, yeah, the book of Deuteronomy is theoretically a separate source, which theoretically, according to later books of the Bible, the King Josiah discovered it, or at least the guy who was cleaning the temple discovered it. And read it and realized they had been, you know, breaking all kinds of laws. And so he tore his clothing and put ashes on his head, and, you know, and they did a whole purification of the cult, centering it in Jerusalem, even though it never says Jerusalem in Deuteronomy. But then Josiah is considered one of the most wonderful kings of Israel, okay, because of this. But he also was strategically not too bright. I think, Doug, you talked about this in your class the other day, about how, I think you did. I know I heard it recently, about how Josiah went out there and said, I am going to stop the Egyptians from coming through here. And so they killed him. He was not too bright. Now, the kings in the north, Omri and his son Ahab, had a long dynasty and a long period of prosperity and economic well-being, because Ahab was very good at doing that, but he was obviously religiously very bad because his wife Jezebel introduced all these other gods. So you can take the pure, pious king who doesn't know how to keep his country from getting overrun, or you can take the more pragmatic king who keeps everybody happy, but who is not faithful to God. A nice choice. Anyway, so next week we're going to meet, and then we'll start with Moses's demise and his fighting God because he does not want to have his death. But anyway, so you have the handout. Does everybody have the handout, by the way?
Yes.
Is anybody missing it? You have it?
I do not, Rabbi.
Please, I will send you a copy, okay?
Thank you.
Anyone
Toda.
else? I think I sent it to
I may need a copy too.
Gail.
Rabbi, I need a copy.
Okay, Rosalie, okay.
Mm-hmm.
All righty. Oh, Suzanne, okay. Which one? Wasn't
Do
Susie?
you
Cook
just
one?
send it on email or you send a printed copy?
No, she
I
sends
sent
it
it on
out as
email, but is that a
attachment.
problem? I can have maybe the office can print a copy and send it to you.
Well, I don't want to give them the trouble. We'll figure it out.
Do you need a copy?
I'd like a copy. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. I will
I'm
send
having
it out.
trouble with my computer though.
Oh, well,
It's okay. It's okay.
I'll have the office send you a copy. How's that? Not a big deal. Okay. So everyone have a great day. Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you in a few days.
Tomorrow.
Maybe
I'll-
tomorrow.
Thank you.
Tomorrow, interfaith.
Thank
Oh,
you.
the
And
interfaith. Oh,
Rosalie,
yeah,
it's
right. I
good to
forgot all
see you.
about it. That's right. I'm doing an interfaith panel on
Rosalie.
suffering in Judaism. They said they picked the topics very specifically for the people that they invited to speak.
Oh, wow.
I don't know what that means exactly.
Wow.
I just heard that yesterday.
That's very interesting.
It is
Yes.
interesting.
Wow.
Okay.
Rabbi,
Bye.
I have
Shabbat shalom. Toda rabah,
Shabbat
Rabbi.
shalom.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Rabbi, I have
Bye.
Okay.